Howdy, howdy, folks. It is time to talk about American imperialism. This is a really interesting topic, and the more that I talk about it and the more that I try to communicate this to my class, the more that this title of this lecture actually does not make sense. So this is the era that we refer to as the age of imperialism. But imperialism as a concept had been around for much, much longer, and in the United States had been around for a lot longer. After all, like, the people that control the land in the United States didn't originally own it. All of that was imperialism. It was British imperialism. And then the United States continued in that lovely tradition by expanding westward. So what we're going to talk about today is the culmination of a phenomenon that, if you had been in my earlier US history class, we talk about the importance of physical land to Americans. We talk about the insatiable desire for space that Americans have. That insatiable desire for space is inherently tied to capitalism. So we're going to talk today about why the United States at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century became aggressively expansionist, or we could call it imperialist. That means that today we're going to be covering a whole host of little wars that collectively make up the United States extending its influence all over the globe. This political cartoon here is about imperialism, and this is Uncle Sam, right? And he's depicted as basically riding the globe. He's reaching his arms around and grabbing places in the Caribbean. This is Cuba, and grabbing Guam and Hawaii and the Philippines. And I put this here because that's what we're going to talk about today. Here are the questions that I want you to be thinking about. What forces have pushed Americans to expand their borders? So if Americans are obsessed with conquering space, if they're obsessed with more land, why? Why are they obsessed with land? What makes them so obsessed with acquiring land? And how have they gotten it? These are critical questions in understanding the relationship of warfare and capitalism, which are questions I'm going to prompt you to answer throughout the rest of this class. What resistance has America faced to expansion, both internally and externally? And why is that resistance important? What people were uncomfortable with expansion? And how does expansion over the rest of the globe define American identity? This is another political cartoon that I love. It's the United States as a bald eagle, and it is reaching all over the globe. And it says 1898, which is the year of the Spanish-American War. And you can see this eagle just grasping onto Manila, grasping onto Hawaii, grasping onto Puerto Rico. So it's stretching from tip to tip. It encompasses the whole globe. That was the idea. Okay, so let's talk first about the forces that pushed Americans abroad. What pushed America to want to expand their borders? Well, originally what pushed America to want to move further westward was the desire for land, and land to grow cotton, land on which to grow beef, land on which to expand their population. These things didn't really change when the whole land in the western United States was eaten up and Americans wanted to expand beyond their oceanographic borders. So it's a combination of wanting raw materials, and those materials really only being available in foreign lands, and wanting places to sell them. So first, let's talk about those raw materials. Americans had increasingly grown used to being able to purchase virtually anything that they wanted. So it was commonplace by the end of the 19th century to be able to get coconuts in Philadelphia. Coconuts do not grow in Philadelphia. Actually, if you want to look at something super fascinating, check out the history of the banana. That is a really, really interesting industry because Americans were totally banana crazy. They loved bananas. They went bananas for bananas. Is that where that phrase comes from? I wonder if that's where that comes from. It can't be. Okay, anyway. Americans wanted things like coffee, coconut oil, olive oil, bananas, things that could not be produced in the United States, and silk. And all of these things were in various areas abroad. They were specifically in warmer climates in the globe. Americans also wanted a place to sell the goods that they were producing. And this applies to both raw materials and produced goods, because America had raw materials from the vast western parts of the United States that it stole from Native Americans. And it also had lots of consumer goods that were like ready to go consumer goods. The example I've given here is a sewing machine, because it was a factory. It was a factory country, it was an industrialized country. And so America had both natural resources like oil and coal, and also produced resources like textiles and sewing machines and railroad cars that it wanted to be able to sell abroad. This is why part of the lecture in the progressive era, and when I talk about when I talk about Republican presidents at the end of the 19th century, many of them issued protective tariffs. That was to protect American industries abroad, right? They really supported American industry abroad. The problem was that in order to sell things, you have to have access to those markets. And increasingly, a lot of the globe was already divvied up. So America is worried because the frontier is running out. Now, this is a broader problem, and I want you to think about that phrase, right? The frontier is running out, and it's not just the American West. The American West was running out, but also all of these places that were considered conquerable throughout the rest of the globe, they were also increasingly conquered, right? So you've got Britain that has a significant empire. The French have a significant empire. Italy has a smaller empire. Belgium has a smaller empire, but these are empires, right? People understood that having global power required on having access to land, right? Power and land go hand in hand. They are equivalent in this era, because that's where you find raw materials, that's where you find markets, that's where you are able to fuel your ships to get to other places. So having that expanding empire was precisely what made somebody powerful. And the United States hadn't gotten a piece of that pie yet. To be fair, that's largely because they kept expanding westward, and that's where they put their energies. So while it's not necessarily part of, well, we haven't necessarily talked about it too much. Now, in some of my classes, I give more lectures, and some of them I give less. One of the lectures that I really like is a lecture called Cowboys and Indians, and it talks about that expansion westward. If you haven't listened to that lecture, just know that over the course of the 19th century, the United States had gobbled up Western land voraciously. By Western land, I mean land west of the Appalachian Mountains, including Texas, right? But also including Colorado and Nevada and all the way to California. That land, of course, had not belonged to America in reality, although it belonged to it in name. It had belonged to Native Americans. But through the practice of genocide, Americans really swept into the American West. Now, some of the reasons that they moved into the American West included the belief that the West was a necessary safety valve. There was the thought that, well, cities are dangerous places. They're places of conflict. They're places where there are too many people. But at least there's always the West. Like, at the very least, we know that we could shove some of that population out into the Wild West, and it would go away. The West was thus ideologically important, but also important as what people called a safety valve for the pressure of cities. I don't know if any of you have ever used a pressure cooker, right? But the way that it functions is that you build the pressure because the heat gets super, super high. And then when it's done cooking, you open the safety valve and it lets out. Pressure cookers, if you don't ever open the safety valve, have the ability to become a bomb because that much pressure is not sustainable. So people worried that cities would explode in social unrest. And the activities that we've been talking about seemed to highlight that. This is an image of the Panic of 1893, right? But there were strikes, there were riots, there were economic depressions that caused great tension in America. And so people are thinking, we need somewhere to go. Well, they had conquered all of the West by the end of the 19th century, and that kind of freaked people out. So in addition to economic pressures, there were also demographic, sociological pressures that made people really feel like expanding westward and then expanding abroad was absolutely necessary. Then there was this dude. Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, Admiral? admirable. Anyway, I forget his rank, but Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And if you want, or if you're writing a paper about it, I've actually linked you to the book here. Oh, look, it's right here. Does it say his rank here? Now I'm curious. It does not. He wrote several books about the importance of sea power. And his basic argument is that if you are going to control the world, you need access to the seas. So if you're interested in that, Maritime Academy and all, see how I listen to what you guys do? If you're interested in that, this is his book. Now, before you freak out about all these chapters are like a page or less. And that's very much so how books in this century worked. But I want you to think about why he would say something like this. He argued that in order to have international dominance, what you needed was trade. And in order to have trade, you needed control of the seas. And you needed that for a few reasons. One, you needed materials, right? Two, you needed a stop-off point. So everybody wants to get to China. Pretty much everybody wants China all of the time. But you can't get to China all that easily if you don't have a place to stop and refuel your ships and restock on water and food. Like, it's not that easy to sail around the globe. So basically, Mahan was trying to argue that you need stopping points, you need military control to protect trade, you need access to materials, and you need safety on the seas if you're going to have a global empire. In other words, what he said was that a global empire is not just about land masses. A global empire is about controlling all of the blue in between those land masses. And he had a lot of influence in the late 19th century because of his rank, but also because of the fact that, well, the things that were left were those waypoints in the oceans. And those, he argued, could give the United States a considerable edge in global competition. Now, we're not just going to call this expansion. And I want to talk just a little bit about why, even though we'll talk more about it over the course of the lecture. These words are often conflated, right? I'm going to use the word imperialism. And I use that word very deliberately rather than the word expansion. Now, the idea of expansion is simply that you are acquiring more and more territory, right? Like, I have my office, and so if I knocked down this wall and took the room next to me, that would be expansion, right? But imperialism is when, in order to do that, you have to conquer somebody. So that's Professor Haney's office. So it would be imperialism if I knocked down this wall and said, you can't be here, you're out. I'm either going to subject you or kill you or kick you out. That's imperialism. The difference between imperialism and expansion is that in imperialism, there's somebody there. And that's what we're talking about now. We're not talking about areas that didn't have any people in them, although many people in the United States framed them that way. This is the age of imperialism because all of the places we're going to talk about had local populations. Take, for instance, Hawaii. Now, for those of you that don't know your geography very well, Hawaii is an island kind of to the southwest-ish of the United States. And Hawaii, for a long time, was independent. And the people that lived in Hawaii were Native American peoples, right? They lived there despite the fact that most other places had been conquered by European powers. And this was true because Hawaii was an economic stronghold. It had a lot of things that people wanted. It had coconuts, it had pineapples, and it had, now I'm wondering whether or not it did have coconuts or pineapples. Pineapples are not Hawaiian, coconuts are, pineapples are not. You can check me on that. Anyway, it had tropical produce. And it had, most importantly, an excellent environment for growing sugar. Now, what happened was that not that local people grew sugar, but that many Southerners prior to the Civil War had expanded into Hawaii and had begun growing sugar by employing the local population. So the wealthy people in Hawaii were actually white people from America. They wanted to be assimilated into America. They wanted to be a state. They wanted Hawaii to be a state. But the native people of Hawaii did not want it to be a state, because being a state came with all sorts of ways of being beholden to the United States. But the United States nonetheless weaseled its way in, partially by having a military base at Pearl Harbor. That was sort of an agreement that Hawaiian people reached to try to prevent acquisition, but that didn't really happen. In the end, there was a rebellion among those white people, and they really tried to force the monarch to allow them more political power. A really badass woman named Queen Liliuokalani came into power in Hawaii, and she tried her damnedest to put down this rebellion. But she was ultimately unable to. There was a rebellion of a few wealthy planters that took over Hawaii with the explicit goal of becoming a state of the United States, which they did shortly after that happened. Queen Liliuokalani was sent into exile, and she actually she spent the rest of her life arguing for Hawaiian independence, which of course never happened. She died in 1917. She wrote an absolutely beautiful song that you have probably heard, so I want to play that for you. It's called Aloha Oi. Now, this is a song that was originally written in her native language, but it was covered in English by Johnny Cash. Now, fun fact about musical history. I have conflicting feelings about Johnny Cash. On the one hand, he's a country icon, right? On the other hand, basically all of his songs are stolen from other people, and almost all of those people are non-white. Johnny Cash did this really amazing thing in early America where he took songs from non-white people and he performed them for white audiences, and white audiences were like, oh my God, that's amazing because a white dude is singing it, but they would have never listened to Queen Liliuokalani. Or the African-American people that Johnny Cash relied on. So anyway, I've got conflicting opinions about Johnny Cash. Phenomenal singer and terribly racist person, but I nevertheless want to play you this song. Now I will warn you, I am going to play both versions for you. However, it is likely that when I upload this lecture to YouTube, it won't let me because of copyright issues. So if there's like a weird cutout where I told you that there would be a song, that's exactly why. You can use these links in yourself, though, which are in the PowerPoint. So let's take a look. Here's Queen Liliuokalani singing it first. This isn't actually Queen Liliuokalani, but this is closer to the version she wrote. That's a lovely version. It's also incredibly slow, and I'm going to bet that most of you don't understand the lyrics. But what I want to point out is the way that this song was mournful, right? We tend to think of Hawaiian music as joyful. This was an ode to the land that she could no longer visit. This is how Johnny Cash sang it. And this is probably the version that we get cut out.
Proudly swept the rain clouds by the cliff, as on it glided through the trees, still following with glee Paleko laying over of the valley. Aloha,
which means farewell to me.
aloha, ike ona, ona noa, ikoli. One fond embrace, ahoy, ea, ea, until we meet again.
Okay. I'll let you listen to the rest of that song on your own, but I think this is a really interesting example. So this is a song that was written by a woman who was mourning her homeland because she was kicked out of it by Americans. The reason that we all know the song is because Johnny Cash covered it. And it's really fascinating to me. It's a really fascinating sort of combination of cultural moments. Hawaii was not the only place where this happened. Another important location in which the United States engaged in imperialism was Cuba. Now, Cuba, like the rest of the places that I'm going to talk about until we talk about China, was controlled by the Spanish. The Spanish, of course, were the earliest people to... That's not true. The Spanish were the first people to discover the New World, or rather they were the first Europeans to arrive there that had the ability to conquer the place. The place that they landed first was Cuba, and so that ended up being sort of a last stronghold. They had been kicked out of the continental United States by earlier wars, first by a Mexican Revolution, and then later by the Spanish-American War. Later by wars in Central America. One of the strongholds that they had left, though, was Cuba. They had Cuba, and they had the Philippines, and they had Guam. These were all Spanish holdings, and Spain was using them in order to make money in the way that it always had, which was primarily through growing sugar. Cuban revolutionaries had been, for a significant amount of time, fighting Spanish folks who were controlling them. The United States, at the end of the 19th century, supported the Cuban revolutionaries because the Cuban revolutionaries wanted democracy and they wanted to be free from monarchy, and these are American things, right? Like totally badass. It would be unfair, though, to say that the United States was totally selflessly motivated. The United States also had significant sugar holdings in Cuba. Do you see how much sugar matters? Sugar matters historically. I mean, there's a shit ton of it in this coffee right here. So there's a lot of business interests in Cuba, primarily regarding sugar. And so Americans are very attached to Cuba and are ostensibly protecting their business interests, right? For that reason, they have a ship in the harbor when an accident happens in Havana. So let's play this video.
The battleship USS Maine steamed into Havana Harbor in late January 1898. While the United States government claimed the battleship was simply making a courtesy visit to Cuba, the ship had really come to protect American lives and property on the island. Cuban revolutionaries had struggled for decades against their Spanish rulers, who had controlled the island for nearly 400 years. In January of 1898, civilian riots left Havana, Cuba's capital, in turmoil and put American lives and investments at risk. The appearance of one of America's premier battleships, bristling with 10-inch guns, helped reassure U.S. citizens in Havana. The Maine dropped anchor in the harbor, and its crew kept a watchful eye on the island. But 3 weeks later, on February the 15th, the Maine exploded in a gigantic fireball that echoed throughout Havana's streets. 266 men were killed as the Maine's 3 forward 6- and 10-inch ammunition storage magazines blew up. America turned suspicious eyes toward Spain. For years, Cuban exiles in America and others sympathetic to their cause had been calling for the United States to force the Spanish out of Cuba.
This was called yellow journalism. So for a long time, the American papers had been publishing stories, excuse me, about how, oh, Spain is awful, Spain is an oppressive tyrant, we need to get rid of Spain, we need to support the revolutionaries. And their reason for doing this was twofold. One, like a legit belief that monarchy is terrible, but two, also maybe a real desire for Cuban land. That sort of instigating was called yellow journalism, right?
Those calls were fueled by the press, which often presented Spain's leaders as evil or less than human. When word of the Maine explosion reached America, some people, including the powerful newspaper owner William Randolph Hearst, immediately blamed Spain. And most of the public believed them. When a team of investigators sent by the Navy concluded that the explosion was the result of a black powder mine, war fever swept across the country.
So we don't know what blew up the Maine, but at that point in time, people believed that it had been Spain because, after all, the United States wasn't necessarily buddies with Spain. They were hanging out in the harbor with massive-ass guns, and you can see how this might have made Spain uncomfortable.
President William McKinley and the U.S. Congress gave in to the public's demands and declared war on April 25, 1898.
That's the beginning of the Spanish-American War, which I'm going to talk about in a second.
Within 6 months, the war was over and Spain was defeated. And the United States was on the road to becoming a world power by gaining Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and the Pacific islands of Guam and Wake from Spain. But a nagging question remained. No direct evidence linking Spain to the sinking of the Maine had been found. So why had the ship blown up? In the 1970s, the Navy launched a new investigation into the case. Admiral Hyman Rickover concluded that the explosion aboard the Maine was not caused by a mine at all. Instead, the ship sank because of a terrible accident. Using various techniques, modern researchers have confirmed Rickover's conclusion that the blast was probably indirectly caused by a spontaneous combustion fire inside the Maine's coal bunker. That coal fire probably heated the wall of the nearby ammunition magazines, causing the shells to explode. So it apparently was a simple accident that destroyed the ship and set up a chain of events that altered the course of American and world history.
Is that a little dramatic? Perhaps. Look, the US was going to take on Spain eventually. Why? Not because it hated Spain, but because it really wanted Cuba. The Spanish-American War was short. It was several months long. It was fairly immediate. And Spain was ousted. In fact, people who went on this called it the Splendid Little War and thought of it as a chance to go to Cuba, right? One of the people who went was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is really interesting here because he was one of the Rough Riders. Now, the Rough Riders were a band of, The Rough Riders were a band of American cavalry. This is one of the last wars where cavalry are super, super important, really. Is that true? I'd say for the most part, because it's one of the wars that's before vehicles, right? So the cavalry was mostly bluster. They did do one thing. They stormed San Juan Hill, but really that could have been done. Like, that wasn't actually going to be a problem. The Rough Riders more like had a blast, and they were like celebrated for just being cool and manly. Oh. I'm going to play a video for you, and then I'm going to talk about white imperialism. So let's take a look at some early footage of Teddy Roosevelt being a manly man on a horse.
pictorial presentation of a power-packed President Theodore Roosevelt. 26th Chief Executive of the United States, his love of country proved a boon to industry, enterprise, and safety. Years after his historic capture of San Juan Hill, the Rough Riders he organized and captained paid homage to their leader. But the Theodore Roosevelt story embraces more than just one battle, more than just a single accomplishment. The Spanish-American conflict, which saw his cavalry regiment make history, was preceded by his resigning as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in order to take active part in the fighting. In 1895, he headed the police board of New York City. His program alienated him from corrupt politicians, but won him public esteem. In 1897, Roosevelt, in federal office under McKinley, campaigned to put our Navy on a wartime basis, for he foresaw the struggle with Spain. His birthday, October 27th, is now known as Navy Day, and he is the father of our modern Navy. An intensive training program for naval recruits was a Roosevelt idea. Supremacy of the American Navy was his objective, one that was attained mightily. Then in 1901, following our success in the Spanish-American War, he was elected vice president. And the next year, after McKinley's assassination, he became president.
Okay, so this is one of the earliest films, really. Like, one of the earliest films in general. And it's certainly the earliest film that's, like, celebratory like this. So, what do you notice about shots like this one?
The Rough Riders he organized and captained paid homage to their leader.
Roosevelt is kind of celebrated as being a cowboy who wasn't actually a cowboy. He's like this last vestige of the Wild West masculine man. And there he is. He can't conquer the West, but he's out there and he's conquering Cuba, damn it. And he's doing it on horseback like a dude. And he's got his monocle and he's just considered to be this like manly man character. And Roosevelt was one of the ways that America really glorified imperialism and glorified this kind of patriotism. In fact, the late 19th century saw the rise of Flag Day. It saw the beginning of reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in school. In general, this was just a huge moment in American patriotism because there had to be some rhetoric that supported this, right? The war was quick, though. The war ended on December 10th of 1898, and many of Spain's foreign lands went to the United States, including Puerto Rico, which was sold to the United States, Cuba, and Guam. Now, the United States had promised that they were not going to acquire Cuba after the war was over, and technically they did not acquire Cuba. However, they did place very, very strict requirements on the Cuban government and the Cuban economy, and required that they maintain a military base in Guantanamo Bay. So while the United States did not actually acquire Cuba, it put a significant amount of influence in it. There was also the Philippines. Now, the Philippines were a little bit more complicated because the Filipinos put up a significant fight after the war was over. So America needed the Philippines in order to support their war with Spain in the region. And they got Philippine support because Philippines had for a long time been resisting Spanish control. And so they were, Amelia Aguinaldo? I think I'm correct in that, supported the United States in kicking out Spain. But then they weren't all that happy when Spain was kicked out and the United States wanted to stay around. So this is a cartoon that said the Philippines were unsure of where they fit in this new acquired Americanism, right? The Philippines ended up being very much so a vassal state. And the United States exploited them, frankly, for resources. They also did the same in Puerto Rico, which was originally spelled Porto Rico. Puerto Rico became a territory of the United States, but not a state. Many people would continue to argue for statehood, but the United States didn't grant that because it had control over Puerto Rico, but not actually a lot of responsibility All of these places are places with immense sugar profit. And that's one of the main reasons that the United States wanted to be there. This one says, did anyone say he wished to tread on the tails of my coat? This is the America having successfully conquered Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Hawaiian Islands, and the Philippines. Why are all of these places valuable? They're valuable because they are way stops. America ultimately wanted to trade with China, not just the sugar production in these regions, but also the military advantage that having islands can give your navy. So the United States really wanted access to trade with China. The problem is that everywhere else did too, and not just access, they wanted a monopoly. The United States was worried that everyone else would shut them out of a monopoly on trade with China, and everybody else was worried that everybody else would do it, right? So everybody's panicked about their relationship with China, and China freaks out. So in China, there's a massive movement, and I'm gonna butcher this, and I'm very sorry, called the Yehetuan movement, Yahetuan movement, and that movement says we don't want American influence. We don't want Western influence in China, and there are a bunch of Chinese people that try to kick out Westerners entirely. Primarily their experience with Westerners had been missionaries that told them they couldn't worship in the ways that they wanted to worship, and they had to worship using Christianity. So Chinese people don't necessarily want foreign influence, right? And there's a big rebellion, and that rebellion threatens to kick countries out of China entirely. It's called the Boxer Rebellion. And in response to that, various nations band together and they say, okay, we're going to protect each other's interest in China, because otherwise we're not going to be able to trade with China. The open door policy was a trade treaty that was negotiated among several very important powers in the world that basically said, we all have open trade to China. We must, however, pay the tariffs that China wants us to pay, and we all have to respect each other for that, and we all have to do it and hold each other accountable. And if anybody violates this, there's going to be trouble. So the open door policy was really important because it signified the ways that China remained the last piece that everybody thought they could divvy up, but China actually had some serious power in that. Despite wanting access to China, America did not actually want Chinese people. This is called yellow peril. Yellow peril is the fear of Chinese influence on America. This is a great political cartoon, a terribly racist political cartoon, showing how people in America thought that the Chinese people coming to the United States would behave. Now, there were a significant number of Chinese people immigrating to the United States. Most of them were going to California. And this is for various reasons, including serious opium usage in China, right? So for various reasons, there are various push factors that are pushing Chinese people to America. But Americans are worried about a lot of things. They're worried about smallpox, typhoid, diseases. They're worried about Chinese prostitutes that are coming in. They're worried about foreign foods. They're worried about typhoid. They're worried about bribery. They're worried about cheap laborers out west, right? So what this really shows is that Americans were extremely racist to Chinese people, even as they wanted Chinese goods, right? It's for this reason that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1883 is passed. So I want to emphasize that this engagement abroad, this desire for places abroad, did not actually mean a desire for the people that were abroad. This is another great political cartoon. And this cartoon exemplifies the ways that Uncle Sam, or the United States, thought that they were responsible to lesser peoples throughout the globe. This is Uncle Sam as a teacher, teaching his pupils how to be members of society, right? How to be civilized is actually how it is saying up here, right? So these are the white pupils. They are sitting and listening and behaving appropriately. And then here we have the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and Cuba. And these are the pupils that are new to instruction, the ones that are misbehaving, that he needs to teach a lesson to. And you notice that they are portrayed as misbehaving children, right? This is the nature of paternalism in this era, is that Uncle Sam is trying to say, you need taught how to be a real person. Filipinos would have probably disagreed with that, right? But you see several other racial stereotypes in here that I want to point out. The African American is considered a laborer and is not allowed into the class on civilization. The Chinese person is locked out, the Chinese Exclusion Act. He doesn't get to be part of this room. And the Native American student is over here unable to understand even the language that is used for civilization. They're just ostracized. So this is a really interesting cartoon because it shows us the ways that America considered itself to be responsible to, but also in control of, everybody else in the globe. That's really what I wanted you to get from Rudyard Kipling's poem, which is totally fascinating. The White Man's Burden. And this, to serve your captive's need, this talks about the ways that America saw itself as a paternalistic force that was caring for uncivilized people throughout the globe. When in reality, they're just being expansionist and wanting that territory. But those rhetorics get complicated. And America celebrated itself as having the burden of civilizing these savages, which was a way to talk about American desire to conquer land. That kind of arrogance, that kind of belief in American superiority would be really critical over the next few decades. And it would be really critical in America's involvement in World War I. So that is where we are going to get in our next class. This is what I've got for you today. If you've got any questions, please feel free to let me know.